everyone for joining us for this artist talk with Casey Lou Miller. I'm Claire Taylor. I'm the visual arts coordinator for the Salt Lake City Arts Council, and I coordinate the Finch Lane Gallery. Right now, we are lucky to be exhibiting Casey's work. Casey grew up in Salt Lake City, and she attended DSU for her BFA, during which she apprenticed with artist Royden Card in the fall of 2017. She received her MFA from Utah State University in 2021 and has returned to DSU as an adjunct professor, where she teaches art. She also teaches art at Makespace in Kayenta. Much of her work is inspired by her time in southern Utah, where she is currently residing. She portrays desert plants, which she views as a form of self-portraiture. Her work bridges two-dimensional paintings and sculptural structures, which fit together like pieces of a puzzle hung on the wall. The forms she creates are truly innovative and spectacular when seen in person. She'll be exhibiting at River Rock Roasting Company in La Verkin on April 7th, and that exhibit will be up for about 2 months. And now let's hear from Casey.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, Claire. I am Casey. Thank you for joining us tonight on this virtual artist talk. Claire covered kind of what I'm up to now. So I'll just jump right into explaining and going through the influences of the exhibition. So intrinsic nature is all inspired by desert plants. And the reason I am so inspired and drawn to desert plants is because they're so resilient, and they have to be living in very harsh, arid climate. And because of the environment that they live in, they have acquired a lot of unique adaptations. And these adaptations to me make them appear almost alien-like, which I find very intriguing and interesting. The reason, so most of my work, as Claire was saying, is cut out of birch plywood. And the reason I cut these forms out as opposed to just putting them in a canvas in a composition is because I'm trying to invite the viewer into the experiences that I personally have had when encountering these plants in the wilderness. So, and like Claire was mentioning before, all these plants are native to the St. George, southern Utah area. So one example here is of a Yucca Pod. This one you can see right here, Rebirth. And in the wilderness, Yucca Pods are, 2 inches, maybe 3. They're pretty small and kind of easy to disregard if you're out on a hike. You're like, oh, there's a little crusty leaf. Why would I look at that? But scale, that's why I tend to make things a lot larger scale than they are in nature, is to kind of not give you the option, or the viewer the option to pass it by. Like, you have to kind of confront it and observe it, even if you don't really want to. So, and for me, like when I'm out in the desert and picking up a Yucca Pod, once you really look at it and have a moment with it, you start to notice all the little intricacies and just really how powerful these small forms can be. All right, so this piece is called Golden Goddesses, and it is also inspired by Yucca Pods. These ones aren't quite as large as the last piece, but they're still good size. And these this piece here is portraying the Yucca Pods after they have died, and they're just crusty and hard, but the centers of them and the seeds are I tried to create the seeds suspending down from the mother Yucca Pods. And I created them with gold leaf because I was trying to kind of resemble that force of life that was still there, even though these pods have died or dead, technically. So this piece is representing kind of that transition of energy from the mother yucca pod through her seeds in an aim to hopefully reproduce and start the cycle all over again. All right. This piece in the exhibit is one of the larger pieces, and but it's actually smaller scale than agaves. This plant, the century agave plant, can grow to be, just because it's really hard to make a 30-foot piece. But this one represents kind of the entire life cycle of a single century agave plant. So it's kind of a story from beginning to end and onwards. The first piece here is resembling, the first piece on the left is resembling kind of the bottom part of the plant that it establishes for anywhere from 15 to 30 years. And then once that bottom is really well established, it starts to sprout a stalk, and these stalks can grow up to 5 inches a day. It grows this stalk in one season, typically in the spring. And in the peak season, it will, like in the middle piece here, fully bloom. And once the plant fully blooms, it starts to drop all its pods and seeds, and the whole plant actually just withers and dies. So I just think it's a very interesting cycle and path for reproduction. It's very dramatic, and it happens all at once, leading up to this pinnacle point, and then the whole plant. But it doesn't die because they reproduce in other ways as opposed to their stalk and the seeds from their stalk. They also reproduce through an underground root system, and so they'll often have like little pups on either side of them. So when the plant leaves, it has continued on its life cycle and passed it on. You can notice in the background too, there is the phases of the lunar cycle, and I put those in there just to kind of further represent the transitions and kind of the time period too, because the lunar cycle is about a month, and even though this would happen in the course of like 3 months, it is kind of referencing that as well. Okay. This piece is named Duality, and it's named that for a few reasons. It is inspired by kind of some time I spent in Snow Canyon State Park during the initial bloom of spring. And it's based off of a yucca plant. And to me, this is kind of, again, like phases the story of one plant. Half of this plant is dead, and the other is it when it's first initially starting to bloom. And it's kind of just resembling when I was in Snow Canyon. I remember seeing all of these yuccas in full bloom, and more often than not, right next to them was a yucca plant that had was completely dead and dried up. So it's kind of just reiterating that fact, that you can't really have life without death, and it's a continuous cycle, and there's two kind of sides to it. So hence duality is why it's named that. It's also named Duality because I'm thinking about sort of the masculine and feminine kind of qualities that these plants possess at different points in time, and how those feminine and masculine qualities and energies are also what drives life and existence, and kind of how you can't have one without the other. So playing with that idea a little bit too. All right, and then this piece here is titled Midnight Bloom, and it is of a datura or jimson weed flower, whatever you want to call it. And these plants have adapted to bloom at night because, again, they live in a very hot, arid climate. And so they can kind of preserve some of their energy and not wither away and get burned, scorched in the sun. So they bloom at night, and they have developed a symbiotic relationship with the datura, or the hawk moth is what it's called. And if you look up here, or I guess it would be to the right top corner of your screen, there is a hawk moth actually carved on top of this flower. And yeah, so that's just showing that kind of pollination in action. Okay, and more about the carving. I relief carve on top of these works because I have found that is a good way to kind of express the more spiritual experiences that I have had when encountering these plants. And the carving symbolizes the way that I would imagine kind of the energy to be pulsing and transferring through the plants. And these things, just because they aren't necessarily tangible or seen in the real world, doesn't mean that they don't exist and that they can't be felt. And I think that's something very important. I'm trying to portray in my work that these tangible real life objects also have this other dimension of not a different reality, but somewhere in between reality and another dimension where we can't necessarily visually see, but we can feel. So that's why I relief carve on top of those. I carve a lot of spirals and implied movements throughout my pieces, again, kind of referencing that never-ending transfer of energy and life. So there's some examples of just the carving up close. The carving for me is just also kind of, like I said before, but kind of my own way to just interpret the energies passing through and kind of leave my own instinctual kind of mark on these plants. So yeah, my work, I aim to kind of portray both the physical and metaphysical aspects that exist in reality and somewhere between. And I paint the backs of these with fluorescent paint, and the reflection off the wall kind of creates an aura. And by doing this, I'm trying to kind of expand on that idea of the plant's energy expanding past the tangible plant itself and into kind of a different realm that we can't necessarily see but feel. And yeah, that kind of wraps up, but I'll wrap it up there. Again, my aim is with this exhibition and my work in general is to create, an ethereal experience that possesses energy that lives within this world, as well as realms kind of in between. There we are.
Thank you so much, Casey. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I'll let you go.
Just a question I'm curious about.
Mhm.
So some of the energetic lines that you've carved into the plant, it almost looks like it could also be reflecting some biological processes in the plant, like such as water or nutrients moving through it, and also your reflections on the wall of the fluorescent paint. almost seem like visual interpretation of photosynthesis in a way. Do some of those biological aspects, are those like also worked into your, I mean, I guess the life cycle is obviously a biological aspect, but I'm wondering if, some of the stuff that I spoke to, if that's purposeful or that just is kind of happenstance that it reflects those biological processes.
Yeah, no, great question. I've never thought about the photosynthesis thing, but that I really like that idea of the reflected paint. But yeah, I'm definitely thinking about like I'm not necessarily like directly referencing like cells and movement of water and stuff, but I think that stuff kind of plays into kind of what makes these plants alive and have an impact on us. And yeah, so it is something like I'm not directly, I think about a little bit, but they're more so just kind of like intuitive marks of what I imagine the life force of these plants to look like. So yes and no, I guess.
I love it. It makes sense that that kind of stuff would show up even through in an intuitive process.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Great question.
Thank you so much, Casey. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. All right.